sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most unexpected revelations. In the rigid world of military hierarchy, respect flows upward through clearly defined ranks. But what happens when a seasoned soldier humiliates someone he assumes is beneath him, only to discover she holds the highest position on the entire base? This is the true story of Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, whose moment of poor judgment became a lesson in respect that would echo through the halls of Naval Base Coronado for years to come. Part 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Base Coronado as Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his combat boots and prepared for another routine day of training exercises. At 34, Marcus had spent 12 years climbing through the military ranks, earning respect through discipline, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to order. His muscular frame and stern expression commanded attention wherever he went, and younger recruits often scrambled to attention when he approached. Marcus took pride in maintaining the highest standards. He believed firmly that discipline started with appearance, respect began with proper protocol, and weakness had no place in the armed forces. These principles had served him well throughout his career, earning him commendations and the trust of his superiors. Today, like every day, he intended to uphold these values without compromise. The training facility buzzed with activity as various units prepared for their morning drills. Marcus surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, noting the crisp uniforms, the synchronized movements, and the focused expressions of soldiers who understood the importance of excellence. This was his domain, where order prevailed and everyone knew their place in the carefully structured hierarchy. As he walked toward the equipment storage area, Marcus noticed a small commotion near the obstacle course. A group of recruits had gathered around what appeared to be a new trainee struggling with basic exercises. The figure was shorter than the others, wearing standard-issue fatigues that seemed slightly oversized, and appeared to be having difficulty with the rope climbing exercise that most recruits mastered within their first week. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he watched the scene unfold. In his experience, soldiers who couldn't handle basic physical requirements often became liabilities in real combat situations. He had seen too many good soldiers endangered by teammates who weren't properly prepared, and he refused to tolerate such weakness in any unit under his watch. The struggling recruit finally managed to reach the top of the rope but descended awkwardly, landing in an ungraceful heap while the other trainees exchanged uncertain glances. Marcus noticed that none of the regular drill instructors were present to address the situation, which meant it fell to him to provide the necessary correction and motivation. Striding purposefully toward the group, Marcus felt the familiar surge of authority that came with his rank and experience. The recruits immediately recognized his approach and snapped to attention, their casual conversation dying instantly as they formed a respectful line. However, the struggling recruit remained seated on the ground, apparently unaware of the protocol required when a superior officer approached. Marcus stopped directly in front of the seated figure, his shadow blocking the morning sunlight. His voice carried the sharp edge of command that had been honed through years of military service. The recruit looked up slowly, revealing features that seemed younger and more delicate than Marcus had expected, but this only reinforced his assumption that he was dealing with someone who didn't belong in this environment. The surrounding recruits stood frozen, sensing the tension but unsure whether they should intervene or maintain their positions. Marcus could see uncertainty in their eyes, but he interpreted this as natural deference to his authority rather than concern about his approach. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of teaching moment that helped establish proper military discipline and respect for the chain of command. As Marcus prepared to deliver what he considered necessary feedback about military standards and physical readiness, he noticed the recruit's calm demeanor. Rather than showing the fear or immediate compliance he expected, there was something almost serene about the way this person regarded him. The recruit's eyes held a depth of experience that seemed inconsistent with someone struggling through basic training exercises. The morning air carried sounds of distant training activities, the rhythmic cadence of marching feet, and the sharp commands of drill instructors working with other units. These familiar sounds reinforced Marcus's sense of belonging and authority in this environment. He had earned his place through dedication and sacrifice, and he intended to ensure that everyone else met the same standards. Marcus began his verbal correction with the firm tone he had used countless times before with recruits who needed motivation. He spoke about the importance of physical fitness, the dangers of inadequate preparation, and the responsibility every soldier bore to their teammates. His words were chosen to inspire improvement while establishing clear expectations for future performance. However, as he continued speaking, Marcus began to notice subtle details that didn't align with his assumptions. The recruit's posture, despite the casual sitting position, suggested someone comfortable with authority rather than intimidated by it. The hands showed signs of extensive training and experience that seemed inconsistent with the new recruit's background. The other trainees remained motionless, but Marcus could sense a growing tension that seemed disproportionate to a routine training correction. Some of them exchanged glances that suggested they knew something he didn't, but Marcus attributed this to typical recruit nervousness when witnessing a superior officer providing guidance to a struggling teammate. As his verbal correction continued, Marcus felt confident that he was handling the situation appropriately. In his experience, clear communication of expectations followed by consistent enforcement created the discipline necessary for effective military units. He had used this approach successfully throughout his career, and he saw no reason to modify his methods now. The recruit listened quietly throughout Marcus's speech, occasionally nodding in acknowledgement but maintaining that same calm demeanor that had initially caught his attention. When Marcus finally concluded his remarks and expected an appropriate response, the recruit stood slowly, brushing dust from the standard issue fatigues with movements that seemed practiced and confident. What happened next would forever change Marcus's understanding of assumptions, respect, and the dangerous consequences of judging others based on incomplete information. The recruit's response would expose a truth so shocking that it would force Marcus to reconsider everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and his place within it. As the morning sun climbed higher over Naval Base Coronado, casting shorter shadows across the training grounds, Marcus Rodriguez was about to learn that sometimes the most important lessons come from the people we least expect to teach them. The next few moments would transform a routine training day into a career-defining experience that would follow him for the rest of his military service. The recruit's calm response began with words that initially seemed appropriate but gradually revealed layers of meaning that Marcus hadn't anticipated. Each sentence carried weight and authority that seemed impossible given the circumstances, yet the tone remained respectful and measured. Other trainees began to shift uncomfortably, their expressions showing increasing concern about the direction of the conversation. Marcus found himself listening more carefully than he had expected, trying to understand the disconnect between what he was hearing and what he had assumed about the situation. The recruit's knowledge of military protocol, strategic thinking, and operational procedures far exceeded anything a new trainee should possess, yet the physical struggle with basic exercises remained unexplained. As the conversation continued, Marcus began to realize that his assumptions might have been fundamentally flawed. The evidence was mounting that this situation was far more complex than he had initially understood, and the consequences of his approach were about to become dramatically clear. The morning that had started as a routine training day was evolving into something that would challenge everything Marcus thought he knew about respect, authority, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. The training ground fell silent except for distant sounds of other units continuing their exercises, unaware of the pivotal moment unfolding near the obstacle course. Marcus Rodriguez, seasoned sergeant and defender of military discipline, was about to discover that sometimes the greatest lessons in respect come from the most unexpected sources, and that true leadership requires the wisdom to recognize authority in all its forms. The recruit straightened to full height, and Marcus noticed for the first time that beneath the oversized fatigues was a bearing that spoke of years of command experience. When she spoke, her voice carried an unmistakable tone of authority that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she began, using his name with a familiarity that immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. "I appreciate your dedication to training standards. However, I think there might be some confusion about the situation here." Marcus felt his confidence waver as he realized this person knew his name despite wearing no visible rank insignia. The surrounding recruits had gone completely silent, their faces showing expressions of barely concealed panic. Several of them had taken small steps backward, as if trying to distance themselves from what they now recognized as an unfolding disaster. The woman continued speaking with measured calm. "I'm Admiral Sarah Chen, and I was conducting an informal assessment of our base's training facilities." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "I wanted to experience firsthand what our newest recruits face during their initial training phases." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. Admiral Chen was not just any high-ranking officer, she was the base commander, the highest-ranking official at Naval Base Coronado. Every soldier on the base, from the newest recruit to the most senior staff, ultimately answered to her authority. The morning sun seemed to grow brighter, highlighting the sweat that had begun to form on Marcus's forehead despite the cool air. His mind raced through the events of the past few minutes, replaying every word he had spoken, every assumption he had made, every moment of condescension he had displayed toward the most powerful person on the entire military installation. Admiral Chen had arrived at Naval Base Coronado 6 months earlier, but Marcus had only seen her during formal ceremonies and official briefings where she appeared in full dress uniform with all appropriate insignia. The idea that she would conduct informal assessments in basic training gear had never occurred to him, and now his failure to recognize her had created a situation that threatened everything he had worked to achieve. The recruits stood frozen in formation, witnessing what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about incidents in the base's recent history. Marcus could see in their eyes a mixture of sympathy, horror, and fascination as they watched a respected sergeant's career potentially crumble in real time. Some of them had heard stories about Admiral Chen's reputation for fairness, but also her absolute intolerance for disrespect and poor judgment. Admiral Chen continued speaking, her tone remaining professional despite the gravity of the situation. I was having some difficulty with the rope climbing exercise because I'm recovering from a minor shoulder injury sustained during a recent training mission with Special Forces units. I thought it would be valuable to understand how our facilities accommodate soldiers dealing with temporary physical limitations. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized that his assessment of weakness had been completely wrong. Admiral Chen hadn't been struggling due to inadequate training or lack of dedication, she had been working through a legitimate injury while conducting important research to improve conditions for other soldiers. His harsh words about military standards and physical fitness had been directed at someone whose commitment to service far exceeded his own. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Marcus, who prided himself on maintaining respect for the chain of command, had just delivered a condescending lecture to the person at the very top of that chain. His dedication to military protocol had been so focused on surface appearances that he had completely missed the most important protocol of all, recognizing and respecting superior authority regardless of circumstances. Admiral Chen gestured toward the obstacle course where she had been training. I've been visiting different training areas incognito to better understand the challenges our personnel face. Today's experience has been quite educational, though perhaps not in the way I originally intended. Her words carried multiple layers of meaning that weren't lost on Marcus. The magnitude of his error extended beyond simple embarrassment. As a sergeant, Marcus held a position of trust and responsibility within the base's operational structure. His inability to recognize the base commander raised serious questions about his judgment, awareness, and fitness for continued leadership roles. The incident would certainly be reported through official channels, and the consequences could be severe. Marcus tried to formulate an appropriate response, but words seemed inadequate for addressing the situation he had created. Military protocol demanded an immediate apology and acknowledgement of his mistake, but the standard formalities seemed insufficient given the extraordinary nature of his error. He had crossed a line that most soldiers never even approached, let alone violated so completely. The surrounding environment seemed to amplify the tension of the moment. Other training activities continued in the distance, with soldiers going about their normal routines unaware that a career-defining crisis was unfolding nearby. The contrast between the ordinary morning activities and the extraordinary situation at the obstacle course created a surreal atmosphere that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Admiral Chen showed no signs of anger or vindictiveness, which somehow made the situation even more uncomfortable for Marcus. Her professional demeanor suggested someone who understood the complexities of military service and recognized that mistakes, even serious ones, could serve as valuable learning opportunities. However, this didn't diminish the fact that Marcus had demonstrated a fundamental failure of judgment that could have serious consequences. The recruits remained at attention, unsure whether they should excuse themselves from the scene or maintain their positions as witnesses to the unfolding drama. Their training had prepared them for many challenging situations, but observing a sergeant accidentally disrespect the base commander fell outside the scope of normal military experiences. They found themselves in the unique position of having front row seats to what would likely become a legendary story within the base's oral tradition. Marcus realized that his response to this situation would define not only his immediate future but also how he would be remembered throughout his remaining military career. Every soldier on the base would eventually hear about the sergeant who mistook the admiral for a struggling recruit. His reaction now would determine whether the story would be told as a cautionary tale about arrogance and assumptions or as an example of how to handle mistakes with dignity and professionalism. Admiral Chen waited patiently for Marcus to process the situation and formulate his response. Her expression showed neither malice nor amusement, but rather the measured attention of someone evaluating how a subordinate handles unexpected challenges. This was clearly not the first time she had encountered situations requiring careful management of human error and wounded pride. The morning breeze carried sounds of normal base activities, vehicles moving between buildings, distant commands from other training areas, and the rhythmic sounds of soldiers engaged in various exercises. These familiar sounds served as a reminder that life would continue regardless of the personal crisis Marcus was experiencing, but they also highlighted how dramatically his world had changed in just a few moments. As Marcus prepared to respond to Admiral Chen, he understood that his next words would be among the most important of his military career. The foundation of respect and authority he had built over 12 years of service had been shaken, and his ability to rebuild would depend entirely on how he handled the next few minutes of what had begun as an ordinary training day but had become an extraordinary test of character and professionalism. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward, coming to rigid attention with a precision that reflected his years of military training. His voice cracked slightly as he began to speak, the weight of his mistake evident in every word. "Admiral Chen, ma'am, I offer my sincerest apologies for my conduct. There is no excuse for my failure to recognize you or for the disrespectful manner in which I addressed you. I take full responsibility for my actions and await whatever consequences you deem appropriate." The formality of his response contrasted sharply with the casual condescension he had displayed just minutes earlier. Admiral Chen studied his face carefully, noting the genuine remorse in his expression while also evaluating his character based on how he chose to handle this unprecedented situation. "At ease, Sergeant," Admiral Chen replied, her tone remaining measured and professional. "While your mistake was significant, your immediate acknowledgement and accountability speak well of your character. However, we need to discuss what this incident reveals about assumptions and judgment within our command structure." The recruits exchanged glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Most of them had never seen a high-ranking officer handle a serious breach of protocol with such composure, and they were learning valuable lessons about leadership under pressure. Their initial shock was giving way to fascination as they observed how both Marcus and Admiral Chen navigated this delicate situation. Admiral Chen gestured toward a nearby bench, indicating that the conversation would continue in a more private setting. As they walked away from the group of recruits, Marcus felt acutely aware of their stares and whispered conversations. He knew that by evening, every soldier on the base would know about the sergeant who had lectured the admiral about military standards. Once seated, Admiral Chen continued speaking in a tone that was firm but not harsh. "Sergeant Rodriguez, your service record shows 12 years of dedicated service with multiple commendations for leadership and training excellence. That's why this incident is particularly concerning. It suggests that even our most experienced personnel can fall victim to dangerous assumptions." Marcus nodded, understanding that Admiral Chen was framing this as more than just a personal failure. His mistake had revealed broader issues about perception, bias, and the importance of maintaining awareness in all situations. The lesson extended beyond military protocol to fundamental questions about how people treat others based on incomplete information. "Ma'am, I realize that my assumptions were completely wrong," Marcus replied carefully. "I saw someone struggling with basic exercises and immediately concluded that they were inadequately prepared for military service. I failed to consider alternative explanations and allowed my preconceptions to override proper respect and protocol." Admiral Chen appreciated his thoughtful analysis of the situation. "That's exactly right, Sergeant. But let's examine this more deeply. What specific factors led you to make those assumptions? Understanding the root causes will help prevent similar incidents in the future." The question forced Marcus to confront uncomfortable truths about his own thinking patterns. He had seen someone smaller than the typical recruit, wearing oversized uniform, struggling with physical exercises, and had immediately constructed a narrative about weakness and inadequate preparation. His experience and knowledge had actually worked against him, creating confidence in conclusions that were completely wrong. "I think I let my experience create blind spots, ma'am," Marcus admitted. "I've seen so many new recruits struggle with basic training that I immediately categorized what I was seeing without looking for additional information. I made judgments based on appearance and assumption rather than taking time to understand the actual situation." Admiral Chen nodded approvingly at his self-reflection. "That's a mature analysis, Sergeant. But there's another dimension to consider. Even if you had been correct about dealing with a struggling recruit, was your approach the most effective way to motivate improvement and maintain morale?" This question struck at the heart of Marcus's leadership philosophy. Throughout his career, he had believed that firm correction and high standards were the best ways to develop strong soldiers. Admiral Chen was challenging him to reconsider whether his methods were actually achieving their intended goals or simply satisfying his own need to maintain authority. Marcus took time to consider his response carefully. "I believe my approach was too harsh, ma'am. Even if I had been dealing with a new recruit, there were more constructive ways to address the situation. I could have offered assistance, asked about any challenges they were facing, or connected them with appropriate resources rather than immediately assuming weakness and inadequate commitment." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Colonel Williams, Admiral Chen's aide, who had been searching for her throughout the base. His expression showed relief at finding her, followed immediately by confusion when he noticed her training attire and the serious conversation taking place with Sergeant Rodriguez. "Admiral Chen, ma'am, your 10 o'clock briefing has been moved to 9:30, Colonel Williams reported, carefully maintaining professional protocol despite his obvious curiosity about the situation. His presence served as a reminder that Admiral Chen had numerous responsibilities beyond this teachable moment with Marcus. Admiral Chen checked her watch and realized that her informal training assessment had consumed more time than originally planned. However, she also recognized that the educational value of this incident extended beyond Marcus to potentially impact the entire base's culture and approach to leadership. "Thank you, Colonel Williams. Please reschedule the briefing for 11 o'clock and inform the participants that we're addressing an important leadership development opportunity," she replied. Her decision to prioritize this conversation over scheduled meetings demonstrated the importance she placed on personal leadership development and crisis management. Colonel Williams acknowledged the order and stepped back to a respectful distance, but his presence reminded everyone involved that this incident would soon become part of the official record. Military bases operated on formal documentation and reporting procedures, and significant breaches of protocol required proper administrative handling regardless of how they were resolved personally. Admiral Chen returned her attention to Marcus, recognizing that their time was limited but the lesson was far from complete. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to think about this incident from multiple perspectives. Consider how your actions affected not only me, but also the recruits who witnessed it, and the broader implications for respect and communication throughout our command structure." Marcus understood that Admiral Chen was assigning him a more complex analysis than simple regret and apology. She wanted him to examine the ripple effects of his mistake and understand how individual actions could impact entire organizational cultures. This was leadership development at the highest level, turning a personal failure into a broader educational opportunity. "I will certainly do that, ma'am," Marcus replied. "I realize that the recruits witnessed a senior non-commissioned officer making assumptions and showing disrespect, even though it was unintentional. They learned that experience doesn't protect against poor judgment, and that authority must be balanced with humility and awareness." Admiral Chen smiled slightly at his response, recognizing genuine insight rather than simply telling her what he thought she wanted to hear. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that will help you grow from this experience, Sergeant. But now I need to ask you a difficult question. How do you think we should handle this incident officially?" The question caught Marcus off guard because it invited him to participate in determining his own consequences rather than simply accepting whatever punishment Admiral Chen deemed appropriate. This approach demonstrated a leadership style that emphasized learning and development over purely punitive measures, but it also required Marcus to demonstrate mature judgment about accountability and appropriate consequences. Marcus considered his response carefully, understanding that his answer would reveal much about his character and his understanding of military justice and leadership development. The morning sun continued to climb higher over Naval Base Coronado, marking the passage of time during what had become one of the most significant conversations of his military career. Marcus straightened his shoulders and met Admiral Chen's gaze directly, understanding that his response would demonstrate whether he had truly learned from this experience or was simply trying to minimize personal consequences. "Ma'am, I believe this incident should be documented and reviewed through proper channels. My actions reflected poor judgment that could have been prevented, and other personnel should have the opportunity to learn from my mistake. I also think I should undergo additional training on leadership approaches and bias recognition." Admiral Chen was impressed by his thoughtful response. Many soldiers in his position would have asked for lenient treatment or tried to minimize the significance of their error. Instead, Marcus was recommending transparency and additional development, demonstrating that he understood the broader implications of his mistake. "That's a mature and responsible position, Sergeant Rodriguez," she replied. "However, I want to structure this as a learning opportunity rather than purely punitive action. You're going to participate in developing a training program about assumptions, respect, and effective leadership communication that will be implemented base-wide." The assignment was both consequence and opportunity. Marcus would have to publicly acknowledge his mistake while also contributing to the professional development of other personnel. This approach ensured accountability while maximizing the educational value of the incident for the entire base community. Over the following days, news of the incident spread throughout Naval Base Coronado despite efforts to keep the details confidential. Military bases were small communities where significant events rarely remained secret for long, and the story of the sergeant who had unknowingly lectured the admiral became a topic of intense discussion among personnel at all levels. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of being the subject of countless conversations, speculations, and opinions. Some soldiers expressed sympathy for his mistake while others questioned his awareness and judgment. The experience provided him with valuable insight into how quickly reputation could be affected and how difficult it was to control narrative once word spread through military channels. However, Admiral Chen's approach to handling the incident gradually became part of the story as well. Personnel throughout the base began discussing her professionalism, her focus on learning rather than punishment, and her willingness to turn personal mistakes into organizational development opportunities. The incident became an example of effective leadership under unexpected circumstances. Marcus threw himself into developing the requested training program with dedication that exceeded normal duty requirements. He researched cognitive bias, studied effective communication techniques, and interviewed personnel at various levels to understand how assumptions and preconceptions affected daily interactions throughout the base. The research process was both humbling and enlightening. Marcus discovered that his mistake, while dramatic in its circumstances, reflected thinking patterns that were common throughout military and civilian organizations. People regularly made judgments based on incomplete information, allowed experience to create blind spots, and failed to recognize competence when it appeared in unexpected forms. Working with the base's Training Development Office, Marcus created a comprehensive program that used his incident as a case study while exploring broader themes of respect, awareness, and effective leadership communication. The program included interactive exercises, role-playing scenarios, and structured discussions designed to help personnel recognize their own potential for similar mistakes. 3 weeks after the incident, Admiral Chen reviewed the draft training materials during a meeting that included Marcus, the training development staff, and several other senior personnel. The atmosphere was professional but still carried undertones of the original incident that had prompted this unusual collaboration. "Sergeant Rodriguez, this is excellent work," Admiral Chen commented as she reviewed the materials. "You've managed to address the specific issues from our incident while creating broader educational value. The interactive components should be particularly effective for helping personnel recognize their own assumptions and biases." Marcus felt a mixture of pride and continued embarrassment as his mistake was discussed in professional terms. The training program represented months of work and research, but it existed only because of his fundamental error in judgment. The duality of the situation, being recognized for quality work that stemmed from personal failure, created complex emotions about accountability and redemption. The first pilot session of the training program was scheduled for the following week, with Marcus serving as one of the primary facilitators. This meant he would have to repeatedly recount his mistake to audiences of fellow personnel, explaining his thought process and the lessons learned from the experience. Preparing for these presentations required Marcus to develop a level of comfort with public vulnerability that was unusual in military culture. Soldiers were trained to project confidence and competence, but effective facilitation of this program required acknowledging error and demonstrating how mistakes could become learning opportunities. The night before the first training session, Marcus reviewed his presentation materials one final time, practicing how he would tell the story of his encounter with Admiral Chen. He had refined the narrative to focus on educational value rather than personal embarrassment, but he still felt nervous about standing before his peers to discuss his failure in judgment. Admiral Chen had made a point of attending the first training session, both to show support for the program and to demonstrate her continued commitment to learning-focused leadership development. Her presence added significance to the event while also creating additional pressure for Marcus to deliver an effective presentation. The training room filled with personnel from various departments and rank levels, creating an audience that represented the full diversity of base operations. Marcus noticed faces he recognized from his 12 years of service, understanding that many of these people would forever associate him with the story he was about to tell. As Marcus began his presentation, he found that his nervousness gradually gave way to genuine engagement with the educational mission. The audience listened intently as he described his assumptions, explained his thinking process, and analyzed the factors that had led to his mistake. Questions and discussion revealed that many personnel could relate to similar experiences in their own careers. The interactive exercises proved particularly valuable as participants worked through scenarios designed to reveal their own potential for assumption-based errors. Soldiers discovered that even experienced personnel could fall victim to cognitive biases when dealing with unfamiliar situations or unexpected circumstances. Admiral Chen observed the session with evident satisfaction, noting the quality of discussion and the genuine engagement from participants. The training program was achieving its intended goals of promoting self-awareness and improving interpersonal communication throughout the base. During the final portion of the session, Admiral Chen addressed the group directly, sharing her own perspectives on the incident and its aftermath. Sergeant Rodriguez's mistake was significant, but his response to it has been exemplary. He has taken full accountability, conducted thorough analysis, and contributed to developing resources that will benefit our entire command structure. Her comments helped reframe Marcus's experience from simple failure to professional development opportunity, demonstrating how effective leaders could acknowledge problems while focusing on solutions and improvement. The audience could see practical applications of the training concepts through real-world example rather than theoretical discussion. As the session concluded, several participants approached Marcus with questions and comments that reflected genuine appreciation for his willingness to share his experience. The conversations helped him understand that his mistake, while personally difficult, had created value for others who could learn from his experience without having to repeat his errors. Walking back to his office after the training session, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past month. What had begun as one of the most embarrassing moments of his career had evolved into an opportunity for growth, contribution, and renewed purpose. The path from mistake to redemption had required more vulnerability and self-reflection than he had ever expected, but it had also revealed strengths and possibilities he hadn't previously recognized. 6 months after the incident that had changed his perspective on leadership and respect, Marcus Rodriguez stood before a new group of recruits beginning their basic training orientation. However, his role had evolved significantly from the authoritarian instructor he had been on that fateful morning when he encountered Admiral Chen. The training program Marcus had developed following his mistake had been implemented throughout Naval Base Coronado and was being considered for adoption at other military installations. His approach to leadership had fundamentally changed, incorporating lessons about assumption, respect, and the importance of understanding before judging that he had learned through one of the most challenging experiences of his career. Welcome to Naval Base Coronado, Marcus addressed the new recruits, his voice carrying authority balanced with warmth that hadn't been present in his previous teaching style. During your training here, you'll learn technical skills, physical conditioning, and tactical knowledge. But, perhaps most importantly, you'll learn about respect, teamwork, and the strength that comes from supporting one another. The recruits listened attentively, unaware that the sergeant addressing them had become something of a legend on the base for reasons that extended far beyond normal military achievement. Marcus's story had been incorporated into leadership development programs, and his willingness to learn from dramatic mistakes had earned respect that surpassed his previous reputation built solely on authority and discipline. Admiral Chen had established a quarterly leadership forum where personnel at all levels could discuss challenges, share experiences, and learn from both successes and failures. Marcus had become a regular participant, often serving as an example of how professionals could recover from significant errors through accountability, learning, and constructive contribution. During one of these forums, a young lieutenant approached Marcus with questions about handling a situation where he had made assumptions about a civilian contractor's capabilities based on appearance and background. The lieutenant's willingness to seek guidance rather than simply hoping his mistake wouldn't be noticed demonstrated that the culture of learning from errors was taking root throughout the command structure. The key, Marcus explained to the lieutenant, is recognizing that our experience and knowledge, while valuable, can also create blind spots that prevent us from seeing situations clearly. When we assume we understand something without taking time to gather complete information, we risk making decisions that can hurt both our mission and our relationships with others. These conversations had become common for Marcus, who found himself serving as an informal mentor for personnel dealing with various leadership challenges. His experience with dramatic failure and recovery provided credibility that was difficult to achieve through success alone, and his willingness to share lessons learned made him an accessible resource for soldiers at all levels. The base's leadership development program had expanded to include case studies from throughout military history, but Marcus's incident remained one of the most frequently discussed because it was local, recent, and demonstrated clear learning outcomes. New personnel arriving at Naval Base Coronado often heard the story during their initial orientation, framed as an example of how mistakes could become growth opportunities. Admiral Chen had been promoted to a position at the Pentagon, but she maintained contact with Naval Base Coronado and continued to reference the leadership lessons learned from Marcus's incident during her own presentations to senior military leadership. The story had become part of her repertoire of examples demonstrating how effective leaders could turn individual failures into organizational learning opportunities. In her final address to the base before departing for her new assignment, Admiral Chen specifically recognized Marcus and the training program that had emerged from their encounter. Sometimes our most valuable learning experiences come from unexpected sources and uncomfortable situations. Sergeant Rodriguez's willingness to acknowledge error, learn from it, and share those lessons with others exemplifies the kind of leadership that makes our military stronger. Marcus had been selected to participate in the Advanced Leadership Development course that would prepare him for promotion to Staff Sergeant, a recognition that his growth and contributions had overcome any negative impact from his original mistake. The selection committee specifically noted his development of training programs and his effectiveness as a mentor for junior personnel. The physical training facilities where the original incident had occurred had become something of a landmark for Marcus, representing both his lowest moment and the beginning of significant personal and professional growth. He often returned to the obstacle course area for reflection, remembering the lessons learned about assumptions, respect, and the importance of maintaining humility regardless of experience or position. Marcus's approach to training recruits had evolved to emphasize critical thinking, self-awareness, and respect for others regardless of apparent circumstances. He incorporated exercises designed to help new soldiers recognize their own potential for assumption-based errors and develop habits of gathering complete information before making judgments about people or situations. One particularly effective training exercise involved scenarios where recruits had to work with partners whose capabilities were initially unclear or seemed limited in some way. The exercise consistently revealed how quickly people made assumptions about others and how these assumptions affected their behavior and communication. Military service requires us to work effectively with people from all backgrounds and with varying capabilities, Marcus would explain during these exercises. Our success depends on our ability to recognize and utilize everyone's strengths rather than focusing on apparent limitations or differences. The recruits responded positively to this approach, often commenting that they felt more respected and valued than they had expected during basic training. The combination of high standards with supportive communication created an environment where soldiers felt challenged to improve while also feeling secure enough to acknowledge mistakes and ask for help when needed. Marcus had also become involved in community outreach programs that brought military personnel into contact with civilian groups, helping to build understanding and cooperation between the base and surrounding communities. His experience with assumption-based errors proved valuable in these settings, where cultural differences and